I was thinking about Mother's Day because, you have to do the Mother's Day sermon or you get in trouble with all the mothers. And I came across an article online about chivalry. And in the article, the woman talked about how modern women reject the notion of men being chivalrous. And she said that this was based upon the fact that of the modern view that a woman doesn't need a man. And she doesn't need a man's help, and therefore she ought to just reject that entire notion of a man doing anything chivalrous to her. And so I thought about that for a while, and I wondered if chivalry was dead. And everybody I asked said, absolutely yes, chivalry's dead. You just don't see it anymore. Well, in the article, she also proposed the idea that by killing off chivalry, we are actually doing a harm to both men and women. And so I began wondering, is there a harm in not being chivalrous? If it is dead, how have we contributed to its death? And so to explore this topic, I wanted to begin in a passage in John chapter 13. And my clicker just quit. Can you advance that for me, David?
Second.
John 13. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going back to God. See, John describes the moment when the Father handed all power and authority over to the Son. If you look back a couple verses, Jesus knows a couple of other things. He knows that his hour has come, that he is about ready to give his life. He also knows that Judas is about to betray him. With all this power at his fingertips, we would expect him to just snap his fingers, Judas, the devil gone, all things solved. But Jesus does something quite unexpected at this moment. Jesus rose from the supper, he laid aside his outer garment and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. See, Jesus rises from the table and takes on the role of a servant and washes the disciples' feet, even the feet of his betrayer. No doubt they would have been more than glad, the disciples would have been more than glad to wash Jesus' feet, but there was no way that they were going to wash one another's feet. Culture dictated at the time that this job was reserved for the lowest ranking member of the household. And in this particular case, the lowest ranking member of the disciples would have been John himself. John should have taken up this charge. He should have been the one to humble himself and to do this. And Jesus' act of humility is not only stunning, but it sets a model for Christian behavior. Now, doubtless, all of the disciples were perturbed by what Jesus was doing, but only Peter had the guts to say anything. And so, we're told in verse 8, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." If there is nothing more at stake here than dirty feet, Jesus' response doesn't make any sense. So Jesus proposes to Peter that unless he allows him to serve him, he can have no share with him. The word share here is actually used in reference to an inheritance. And so unless Peter allows Jesus to serve him, Peter cannot share in the inheritance that is to come. And so Jesus sets down a principle here that by serving, by being there for each other, it allows us to store up heavenly treasures. It allows us to understand what it means to be a disciple. Jesus finishes his task and then he wraps up the lesson for them. And when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to also wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. He has called us to serve and accept the service of others. Jesus sets a standard that serving isn't about having power over someone else, but rather it's about humiliating yourself, humbling yourself before the other person. In service to one another, we demonstrate that we're not better than each other. We demonstrate our humility to each other. In our service to each other, we show that we are a part of Christ and that He is a part of us. So Jesus, in this position of power, and He's recognized by His disciples as one who has authority, and yet He's willing to humble Himself in the service of others. Somehow our culture has taken the act of a man serving a woman and twisted it into something bad. That it's derogatory toward women, that it doesn't help them become independent. And one of the ways we are guilty of allowing chivalry to die is because we've taken this act that's meant to be an act of respect, an act of humility, and we've turned it into something bad. Notice in verse 27, Jesus says, if you know you ought to serve, you're blessed if you do it. You know, service is not only meant to be a blessing to the one who performs the act of service, but it's meant to be a blessing to the one who receives it as well. And therefore, in our service, we ought to see that we are being a blessing to others. And when we refuse to let somebody serve us, well, we're not only missing out on the blessing, but that person is missing out as well. Can I have the next slide, David? We've allowed the notion of independence to trump the roles of service given to men by God. In Ephesians 6, Paul exhorts children to honor their father and their mother. And the idea of honoring your parent is not just limited to obedience, but you treat them with respect. You give them your service and what you do and how you behave toward them. And when we fail to teach children to honor their parents, well, we actually set them up for a kind of a disastrous relationship with God. And how, when young men begin the training of how to learn to serve and treat women, they begin that training at home when they learn to respect and serve their moms. You know, 1 Timothy 5 says, treat the older women as you would your mother, and treat the younger women with all purity as your own sisters. And so Christian men are to treat older Christian ladies, how? As their mother. How are they to treat their mother? By serving her, by treating her with honor and dignity and respect. Now notice, this service to women that Paul calls Timothy to doesn't stop with just the older ladies, right? It also extends to the younger ladies, that he's to treat them with purity as his own sisters. Now when I thought about that, brothers and sisters tend to treat each other how? We've got some examples of that. We all know that what happens. But the idea here is that purity means not only chastity, but service. A Christian young man is to treat all women he encounters in service, in honor, and in respect for the way that who they are and what he's called to. You need to pay more attention, son. Honor Dad. Yeah. Chivalry is an act of service that shows that a man has a proper and respectful attitude toward women. When a man opens chauvinist. He's not saying she's not capable of doing it herself. He is serving her. He is becoming the man of godly character that God calls him to become. You know, we in our culture, in our culture, we're being taught, and it's amazing that men and women are all the same. There's no difference between them. In fact, when science discovers the difference between men and women's brains and all this other stuff, it's headline news, because we're convinced that men and women are all the same. You shouldn't treat them differently. Well, when you get a group of guys, a group of young guys together, how do they treat each other? They're roughhouse, don't they? Is it any wonder when we taught young men that there's no difference between them and women, that violence against women is on the rise? Because they have been taught that they ought to treat women with dignity and respect, that they need to serve women, not use them as punching bags. And so we've allowed chivalry to die to the detriment of the women around us. That women should allow men to serve them, and in so doing, help them fulfill their calling in Christ. Allowing a man to serve you isn't meant to be a detriment to you. It's not a character call, but it's an act of service so that you can be treated with the proper dignity that God expects for you to be treated as. Men need to pick up their responsibilities and serve the women around them with the dignity and respect that God calls us to. Even if women are going to reject our acts of service, they don't want us to hold the door open for them, does that negate our responsibility to do it anyway? No. If God has called men to serve the women around them, then we ought to do it regardless of the response that we receive. Being a man, God calls you to acts of service not just to the women around you, but to who? To everyone. It's not that you're singling out the female gender for special treatment. As a man, you're called to serve the elderly, those all around you. And especially as a married man, you're called to serve your wife. Husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for them. Well, as men, we tend to demonstrate our love in acts of service. You know, guys, it's kind of disingenuous of us to complain that chivalry is dead when we're not even chivalrous toward our own wives. You know, the other day, Kelly and I were out, and I've had this article in my mind. I've been thinking about it, so I've been trying to open the car door for her. And boy, sometimes I have to run her down to get out there before she does. I mean, we're just not used to it. We've gotten out of the practice of doing it. So we need to get back into that practice. That we ought to serve our wives in the dignity and respect that we need for them to. And so, if chivalry is dead, it's only because we're not practicing it. That it's a concept that both men and women should embrace. That it's meant to be an act of service that follows the example of Christ that he set before all of us. And it benefits all parties involved. Men perform acts of chivalry, learning to serve the women in their lives. And women ought to be gracious enough to accept those acts of service. And to understand that it's not meant to be demeaning. It's meant to be humiliating. That a man humbles himself and shows the deep respect and care he has for the women around him. Now, I realize this morning's sermon hasn't been one to call you to Christ, but the act of Christ, the act of following him, is an act of service. That it's really nothing new. And that Christ calls us to serve him and the people around us. And so I want to encourage that anyone who is not a Christian to take him on in baptism, to begin that life of service. But then to understand that it is a life of service. That we live our lives lives in service to Jesus and to the people around us. And sometimes those people don't want our service, but folks, it does not negate our responsibility to offer them service anyway. If you have a need or want to respond to the gospel, we want to encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.
I heard an old